Hey, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Modjeska Simkins School for Human Rights. This evening, of course, we have a special guest, Lewis Pitts, who will be helping us this evening to really understand and talk a bit about some of the ideas and ideologies behind a lot of the issues we've been discussing this semester. He'll be getting a more formal introduction from Brett Bursey in just a moment. But we're going to start off tonight by really delving deeper into really understanding the structures and the forces that we're having to deal with as activists and as engaged citizens, not just in South Carolina, but as engaged citizens and activists in the United States. So we're going to get started with that this evening. And I'm hoping, especially tonight, that folks will stick around after the class is over, because we do want to kind of have some deeper discussions about not just this class, but also thinking ahead towards the practicum class next week, and thinking even beyond that to some other things that we really do want to discuss and really put on the table this evening as well. All right, so Brett, did you have anything you wanted to add to that introduction this evening?
No, let's get right with it, Dr. Greene. We'll talk about social and political theory. Why don't you start it off, and I can chime in, and if Louis has something to contribute, he's welcome.
Sure, definitely. So I'm going to go ahead and just share my screen. We have a PowerPoint here that we're going to use more as sort of bullet points, so to speak, to kind of help guide our discussion this evening. Again, this is really, I think, a PowerPoint that it seems straightforward. It seems pretty basic, but the thing is that knowing the basics is always a good thing. So let's go ahead and get started with that, shall we? Let me see if I can. All right. So when we're talking about class 10 this evening, we're talking about social and political theory, otherwise known as what theories shape the lives of the citizens of South Carolina. And again, I think a lot of this is probably includes material you've heard of before, you've discussed before. It certainly includes material we've touched on before in this class, but today we're kind of laying it all on the table so we can have a firmer grasp of all of it.
Well, Robert, I'm going to mention that the conceptualizing political theory, you have to find out, well, where did the political theory come from, and there's probably a social mores that's reflected in there. Who controls those things? Where did it begin? And what kind of values do the humans have that made the theories? And so we know from the Modjeska School that the humans that made the theory of the United States of America were the South Carolina delegation, certainly, were people that enslaved human beings, and that they were very materialistic, acquisitional, and they weren't at all open to sharing and having social relations. That the fact that we have those shortcomings in human theory and human relations and human understanding of why are we here. We don't raise people in this country. I mean, certainly the white, you know, Protestant-oriented uh, majority of the country doesn't take the time to go off to the cave, as some societies did to find themselves, or as native societies did in America to go seek your name. We know what our purpose is. It's to get a job, prosper, and consume. And so that when you set those values that people are born into, all too often they don't actually think about them or reflect upon them. That's what we want to do today. We want to provoke people to think about how their human, being raised as a human, affected their social, religious perspectives, and then how is the political theory in this country compatible or incompatible with elements of that. Dr. Green?
And I think that's a really interesting way for us to begin tonight's class, right? To think about the idea of politics being, as the screen says, determining how a society puts human values to work. And oftentimes, if you watch the news, if you listen to politicians give their spiel about American life, society, and so forth, you often that the United States is an idea, right? It's an idea. And so these debates about politics as human values are particularly important. Some Americans at least, like to maintain that our system of freedoms, democracies, and so on and so forth embody certain values that are worth emulating. But again, the values that we see in politics leaves that
Present.
questioning and conversation debate. And so certainly when we talk about politics as a delivery system of values, and you think about some of the values that American society and the society of South Carolina really hold up, this should raise some deeper questions about the kinds of politics we're talking about here, the kinds of values that we are utilizing every single day.
Robert, the question needs to also tie into, and people be thinking about, where do you learn things? Who educates you? And you've heard me mention a number of times a very old and tired political trope that's so true and becomes more obvious to me as I get older. Education is the placenta of the state. And so what were we taught growing up? Who wrote the books? What were we supposed to learn? There used to be some value in what we call the liberal arts education, where you understood critical thinking and kind of the origins of things. That's become diminished in today's college world. And the University of South Carolina now appears to be operating as taking more out-of-state students and in-state students to be just simply able to sustain itself. And one of the things that I think is interesting in some cultures, where people go to college for their higher education after a period of reflecting on what it is they want to do. What do you want to be when you grow up? And you see Israelis as an example that has some problems. But there is a period of growth in Israel when people can choose to do something for the people, a national obligation where you go off and you work with folks and you get some experience. We don't have that type of pause. We go straight into college. The people that are supposed to go there to get a good job and to make money. And so we also have an educational system that does K through 12 that's designed to support that type of system. So education grows what the state needs to sustain the state's values.
Exactly. And that actually leads to our first part of thinking about political theory, which is, after all, it's all about money and power. And as Brett was alluding to a moment ago, we were talking about how education works and how today's educational system really devalues the humanities, the liberal arts tradition, critical thinking, and so forth, and instead upholds the idea of quote unquote job skills or finding a job, that kind of thing. Then you really get into questions of what kind of society we are really trying to build and enact. And certainly finding a job, finding work is something that all of us have to do. That's understandable. But when you're using not only college, but also K through 12 education to really de-emphasize history, literature, the arts, music, the humanities more broadly speaking, and courses and classes that really encourage critical thinking, then you have to think about, well, why is that the case? Why is our educational system and our political system more broadly speaking really focused on thinking about, in essence, creating worker bees for our capitalist economy? So again, thinking about the fact that it's all about money and power is really the first step to thinking about political theory more broadly speaking. And again, this seems fairly obvious, but as you're going to see, this basic maxim really ties into everything else we're talking about, not just this evening, not just with the practicums next week, but really ties back to everything we have discussed this semester.
Well, Dr. Greene, the following the money is something that is just an absolute critical task for organizers to be able to know how to do. And in the 25 years that we've been working in this field, I apologize for talking so much, but this is my portfolio here. South Carolina was the last state in the nation to actually have a web portal where people could go to find out who was contributing, who was buying the elections. And we'll get into that a little more when we get into the political, into breaking down the way money controls power. But the way that we practice electoral politics in the United States of America, in most socially oriented democratic industrial nations, you would go to jail for doing what we do here. And it's quite clear that the dominant money driving politics is coming from corporations, which we will get into further. Dr. Greene?
Mhm. And again, with this idea of money and power being instrumental to American politics, take, for example, what we see right here in the Palmetto State. There's been a lot of analysis done by the Institute on Money and State Politics that in South Carolina, and this is actually really the case across the country, but it's especially an acute issue here in South Carolina, incumbents with a lot of cash in the bank, a lot of campaign finance spending are virtually unbeatable. So if you've noticed in recent years, you see the same incumbents winning election after election on the state level, then this is a big reason why, that they can stay in office for a long period of time, as long as they keep bringing in the cash. And as long as they keep bringing in the cash, the question becomes, where are they getting that cash from? That's allowing them to stay in the office. Now, South Carolina has among the lowest percentage of contested legislative seats in the nation. Let's think about what that means for a second. This means that even going beyond the basic problem of incumbency and incumbents winning elections over and over again, a lot of seats in the state house and the state senate and even Congress, they aren't really being competed for the way they would be in a healthy, functioning democracy. Now, I could sit here and joke, well, South Carolina and democracy often they'll go in the same sentence, but this problem has only gotten worse and worse and worse in recent years. So again, this should really make us think as activists and concerned citizens, where is the money coming from? How do we follow this money to really understand what politicians in South Carolina are doing on our behalf, or really what they are failing to do on our behalf? Now, follow the money. It's part one of this. Part two is follow the power. In this case, two kinds of power that we're talking about in particular: political power and then corporate power. Now, these are often intertwined, but I do want to spend some time this evening talking about what these terms mean in basic and understanding how they influence our strategies and tactics as both concerned citizens and as potential activists. So again, following the power is really key here. Now, political power, of course, this again relates a lot to following the money. If you follow political power, you're looking at the two-party system as it is in the United States, and specifically within South Carolina, which we'll talk more about in just a moment. But certainly, the question of political power is one that we have to think about time and time again. Think about how many issues during the course of this semester we've talked about in a historical context that took decades, if not generations, to address because certain groups of people did not have the right kind of political power or only had it for a certain amount of time. You think back to, historically speaking, again, the Reconstruction era in South Carolina, which is considered the most democratic era in the state's history. You have political power spread out not just amongst African American men, but also amongst many poor white men as well, who had not had that kind of power in the state before. You look at politics of South Carolina today, however, and again, this concern over who holds political power is a very important one. Again, that's tied deeply to following the money and also to corporate power as well.
These are important points, Dr. Greene, that people need to understand that this country that was founded with the documents that everybody gives all this reverence to, but that our Constitution says nothing about parties. And leave this up here long enough for people to read what John Adams had to say and what George Washington had to say about parties, that they warned against them. And they had an understanding of what would happen, and by gum, we didn't listen to them. And so one of the things that we find it rather sometimes painful in South Carolina is to denigrate both political parties. Because one of them's got to be better than the other. Yeah, one of them's better than the other at trying to work within the existing system. The existing system is not benign. The existing system needs to be replaced. I think you understand that, or you wouldn't be sitting through these classes at Modjeska School. And so we have to recognize that to participate within the existing system is a recognition that what you're trying to do is make the existing system kinder and gentler. There's an old trope about you can trust a liberal to grease the knife they use to cut your throat. Quite often they don't know they're doing that. They don't know they're complicit with that. They think that's what it is. And so that gets a bit touchy sometimes when you're telling people that, and I think it's also overstated sometimes when you tell people there's no difference between them. And I know I go back to arguments, not about Bernie and Hillary, but about voting for Humphrey versus Nixon. That same argument has been going on probably since, well, since what would have been who ran with against Truman. I can't help me, Robert. There was a
Thomas Dewey.
yeah, and well, the Progressive Party, but before that, the election before that, so the discussion about we shouldn't ride the kinder horse because it supports the system. There is a challenge for progressives when that question comes up, as it does every 4 years, as to what does that mean to those in America that have the privilege that's being denied, certainly to people that aren't white, certainly white male Americans. And so during the Vietnam era, there was an argument, and I was on the side that we have to vote for what would be the results that would kill the fewest people around the world. What we called at that point was the third world proletariat. The working class had been shipped out of the country, or we dealt with them as if they weren't here. And then the people of color in the United States were kind of like the indigenous proletariat. And so that is, what's that, 50 years ago, 60 years ago? That has changed now as the third world, formerly known, has thrown off a lot of the kind of imperial and colonial yokes. And those contradictions of exporting your working class are coming home closer and closer to the middle class Americans. And the middle class was this mythical thing that was created by the people with all the money to make the middle class, which are mostly white male Americans that are running families and being happy, to make them think they're still getting over, predicated on the privilege they have that they're not necessarily aware of. That's a complicated equation that is actually falling apart at this point in the life of the country.
Exactly. And I think this is, again, really important to understanding the kinds of forces that are really arrayed against you as activists. Okay, so let me just go ahead. Miss Neal, I see your hand is raised. You have a question or comment for us right now?
Yes, I was trying to start my video, but I wanted to say that I'm actually having a very hard time concentrating and following today because an issue from last class was not addressed. The fact that nigger lover was used and nobody has yet said anything is problematic for me, and I can't sit on this call and act like it's okay.
Well, I'll just tell you right now that we're going to deal with that at the end of class. We want to devote some time. Go ahead.
That's problematic that it's not being prioritized as to address it at the beginning of the class.
Well, we're not going to just deal with it. Let me just put it to you this way. We're not just going to deal with it tonight. We're actually hoping to do a much deeper discussion about it as well beyond this evening, because certainly we do want to devote some time to discussing that today. But we have brought in a guest lecturer tonight for our topic this evening. So we do want to get through this and then give that particular issue the proper time it deserves as well.
Okay, well, I'll be hopping off because I won't be able to focus like it didn't happen, because I am very disturbed by it. So I can't play like I'm going to be sitting here paying attention. And it's problematic that it wasn't prioritized and addressed. It shouldn't be pushed to the back because it's not okay as someone that is hosting this class. A white man saying nigger lover, that is not okay. And so we shouldn't put that to the back of the class. It should have been addressed last class, and it needs to actually be addressed now. Because you have a lot of Black folks, Black women, Black men in this group, and that was not okay.
Well, you know something? All right, then. Brett, do you mind if you just call a quick audible and talk about this now?
Well, Dr. Greene, I don't know. The issue's been taken out of context.
It's not taken out of
we-
context. You shouldn't have used the word. That's what we're saying.
Well, there are those of us that believe that in a class where we're studying the brutality of racism, and the example that I was using was I was quoting rednecks beating me for stopping them from beating up a person of color. I was maybe 20, 21 years old. This is 1969. The police were present. And so what the takeaway is that racism is a visceral thing that's in people's guts. These people hated me more than they did the black guy they were beating up. We
You're
need to
centering yourself
understand.
here. I'm
we
sorry
need-
to interrupt, but you're centering yourself. And that's the issue too.
What-
But right now, like the fact that you so
Okay,
carelessly
Miko,
used the word and it
Miko,
was
there's
addressed,
some.
it was made out to be an issue last time. And you
Mhm.
all didn't address it, or you didn't apologize, you didn't hold yourself accountable as someone that's teaching this word. That word is not okay to be used.
Well, I have a difference of opinion with you that I've shared
And
with our
see, that's the
staff.
problem. So I'm just gonna go ahead and exit
Excuse me,
because
Miko.
this is
Part of-
ridiculous. So you all have a great
That's
night.
Shaterica, not
And I
Mika.
won't be graduating from this class, and I won't be referring anybody to it if that word is just gonna be used.
Thank you, Miko. So this is why we didn't want to broach this, because it's a longer conversation,
Shaterica.
and there's no way to really resolve it without.
It is a way to resolve it
Oh.
so carelessly and
Shaterica's
not
sitting
skip
here
over it.
quietly
It's
with her
an
hand up.
issue. Yeah, it can be resolved so easily, but you're trying to skip over it like it's not an issue. And it is an issue.
How do you-
And you're centering yourself at the same time, which you've been doing this whole time.
Let me just say to Shaterica, to Miko, to everyone else here who've raised this issue, both in class and the chat as well. And I want to recognize everyone talking about this evening. Courtney, Kayla,
Thank you, Dr.
Tiffany,
Greene.
and everyone here. First off, I want to say that I do apologize that we haven't talked about this issue sooner. Our thinking here is that we really wanted to kind of allow for a chance at the end of class to talk about it. And then we did sort of touch on the end of last class as well, but we don't want folks to feel as though we are ignoring this issue. And at the same time, tonight's conversation that we're having about political and corporate power and the like is one that we feel is important. And our original plan was at the end of class to say, we want to have a conversation and also to really think about how we do a deeper dive conversation about what happened last week, because it actually ties in some larger issues about how we go about creating the kind of just and open community that we all, at the end of the day, desire to have as activists, not just in the Modjeska School, not just in the Progressive Network, but in the process and trying to create and craft what a lot of folks call a beloved community. Ultimately, as the lead instructor of the Modjeska School, I want to say that I want to take full responsibility for what's going on here. Because again, I want to make sure this is a welcoming space for everyone who's in the class. I want to make sure it's a space that everyone enjoys being in. I want to make sure it's a space where we're able to really enjoy each other's company and comradeship. And so I deeply apologize for not dealing with this sooner. I hope to again devote some time a little bit later on to talk about it. But I can tell that a lot of people want to talk about this, want to address this issue right now.
Well, Robert, I'm going to apologize to Miko and Melissa and Robert John, who took issue immediately with it, and that we should have set this up in such a way as that this is a safe space to discuss things that are painful. I don't believe, and this is the argument that we can have, I don't believe that we can avoid the things that are painful. And I also believe that, as Robert just said, what's really important is how can you win a revolution if you don't have allies that aren't just like you? And so that's the longer class.
Our allies don't have to walk around saying nigger either. So that's what I'm getting at. Dr. Greene, I hate that you have to apologize but it's not your thing to hold and apologize for. So I'm gonna just go ahead and hop off because I still don't like the way that it's being handled, and I'm about to get very upset. So I'm just gonna exit, and I won't be returning.
Shaterica, before you exit, I wanted to ask you, I wanted to see, okay, so because I want to give Lewis his time as well this evening, because he is a guest for our class tonight. But I want to give a few minutes, because I do want to get back to talking about corporate and political power here. But I also want to give folks the time they need to really process some of this. I'd like to devote a bit of time right now. Does anyone else want to chime in about what happened last week? Just want to speak their piece about it and how we can go forward together. Okay, ready to move forward.
I'm happy to. This is Courtney speaking. I think we just saw a lot of very different and important reactions in this moment. So I want to draw attention to the apology that was presented by Dr. Greene and the modeling of that. And I also want to draw attention to the immediate defensiveness that was presented by another speaker on this call. I think it's important when we share space to understand that pain does not live in the past for a lot of people, Black people. It does not live in the past. So even when we are, in my professional opinion, as a Black person, 365 days of the year, it's important to, when we create spaces, that we don't alienate people, and we understand the impact of that word, because that's why it was used in that original scenario. It was used as violence. It was used to alienate. So when we speak about historical moments in the present, there's no reason to bring that part of the violence of history to the present. It would have the exact same impact if you had said N-word. We know exactly what you're saying. So there's no reason to bring up Bull Connor and like those images that word evokes. Does that make sense? Like, is that clear?
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, anyone else?
Hi, I also feel, that I need to speak up because my name was put in, I'm not sure appropriately, to explain what my concern is, because being a graduate of the Clyburn Fellowship Program, I totally understand safe spaces. And in our fellowship program, we have had many conversations. And then when there was something that came up that was offensive to others in the fellowship, we timed out. We timed out right then. We had a discussion, and then we moved from there. So for me, that word is also bad, but it was the use. I've heard boy used several times, and I've been holding it in. Trying to understand this platform, right? Because as an African American woman, the videos that are played, the songs that are shared, I don't relate to them culturally. So, again, I'm learning a lot. So I want to make that very clear that I am learning a lot in this class. But when something hurts, it just hurts. And so, that is my position. And I think there was a woman, I don't remember who it was, but last week, a white woman said, there's just words that shouldn't be said. So, I don't think that it's just a few of us African Americans that feel this way. I think there's other people that feel this way as well. So that's, I just wanted to share my point of view. And the fact that it hurts and it cuts deep, and maybe this class isn't for me either.
Well, Miko, I want to thank you for your comments there, because those are comments that I think we all want to take to heart not just for what happened last week, but just thinking more broadly about how progressive and radical spaces can and should be open to everyone. Now, I actually...
I like to chime in, Doc.
Sure, Omari, go right ahead, please.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm talking into my laptop, so the audio might not be the best. I'm gonna try to get as close as I can. For me, in this work, intention matters. So I've been called, nigga a million times by my own people. Certainly, there's a ownership that I think we might feel if we piling around with our crew. But as a poet and a person who deals with words, I feel some type of way about the word, but I also think intention matters. And the way that I heard the word in context, I don't believe that there was the intention to harm, nor do I believe that's Brett's feelings about, African Americans, Black people. So for me, hearing it in the context of a story made it different from him just outright, if I'm with my people and I choose to use the word and we decide we want to own it and transform it, that's between me and my crew. But if somebody else outside of the culture calls it to me, then yeah, it would be problematic. So that's just my thing. And as a classroom instructor, I thought that addressing it at the front of the class would hijack the entire class to the point where we wouldn't recover and be able to address the rest of the lesson. So I was comfortable as an organizational member to honor what happened in a contained space to address it and see it through after class. And I support, Dr. Greene's facilitation, in that original call. And I also appreciate the audible of addressing people's harm now. So yeah, that's just my 2 cents. The only thing carrying over from last week is I don't want to I think the original comment was that there's words that white folks should never use. And to me, to even make that determination would be an act of whiteness, to decide who can use the word and who can't. A1, because I don't really believe that it's Black people's word, even though there's NWA and this and that. So A1, it would be problematic for me to decide who can use a word that's meant to harm or whatever, number one. And number two, the second question around how white people are supposed to conduct themselves in the space. If I truly believed that an indignity was inflicted with intention or even unintentionally with on the class and individuals, then I would have spoken up in the moment myself. I just don't, but I'm only speaking from the I perspective. So I just wanted to add opposing opinions while I still also respect everybody's feelings around the hurt of the word.
Dr. Greene, if I may,
Sure.
I'd like to just acknowledge that a Black woman felt so harmed by the word that was spoken, whether or not anyone else shared that experience. A Black woman felt so harmed and so inclined to speak to that experience that she stopped the class because she could not continue with the class. It doesn't have to be anyone else's harm. It was her truth and her harm. And in response to that, to Courtney's point, the response that she got was defensiveness, not acknowledgement, and not any attempt to repair what had happened. Whether it went with the original schedule of the class or whatever, she experienced that harm. Not only did she experience, then other Black women jumped in the chat box and said, that is also my experience. It is hard for me to sit through this class. And what we're getting now is excuses. And our feelings are not being validated, right? Like, we don't need anyone to speak to whether or not our truth is accurate, because it's our truth. And to also point out that a white person actually initiated this conversation last week when they pointed out in the chat box when it occurred that it was not appropriate to use this word. And I know that white person also messaged the speaker separately, and it was not addressed in the last class. And so it carried over, and we came giving the benefit of the doubt that it would be addressed in this class. But instead, when a Black woman was courageous enough, and we know what it's like to be put on the back burner, so to be put at the end of class and to be told to wait when it was pressing on her heart, and now to be like, have her feelings not validated, to me, that just perpetuates even more harm. And it's triggering for me to sit in this space, in this moment, and to hear that instead of just acknowledging her feelings, to like, instead to try to rationalize them and to some extent gaslight her about what her experience was. I think, we can be progressive. We can say we're for all of these causes, and we shout, listen to Black women, and we use our labor and all this other stuff. But in this moment, this was a chance for everyone to live those values. And instead we left her like shut down. And I think that's like problematic. And to have to sit in this course, and we don't have to, we get to choose. And it's also, to some of the other people's point, it might not be a space for me either. It's disappointing because it's hard enough for us to find safe spaces.
I just want to say, I really do appreciate folks really taking the time to talk about how they feel about the situation. And one of the things that I really wanted to say right now is that I want to make it quite clear that these are the kinds of conversations that we do want to give space for as well. I don't want anyone to feel in this class that their feelings, their beliefs, their attitudes are being downplayed or being dismissed. That's the last thing I want anyone to feel. I know that in academia, we have this phrase, a teachable moment, where folks have a chance to say, okay, this is where I screwed up. This is where I want to fix things. And I know for me personally, as a lead instructor for this class, I have really appreciated what everyone has said here this evening. And again, I don't want to make any excuses for last class. I will say that at the end of last week's class, and again, this is not an excuse, but when everything was happening and going on, I thought, well, maybe we can, because Melissa had said her piece at the end of class, and I thought maybe we'll have a chance down the road to talk about it as well. But certainly, I do want to make it clear that the Progressive Network and folks and have been talking about this, and we really do want to make sure that we address this. And I apologize for getting Melissa's pronouns wrong there. My apologies there as well. But we do want to make sure that folks understand that this is a welcoming space, that this is a space that we want everyone to feel included in.
Robert, let me just say that I apologize from the bottom of my heart, because I really want to help build a cohesive, multiracial movement in this country, in this state, that can actually have the power to make the change. And I need people to work with me. I've been working at this for a long time, needing some help. And this is, as Dr. Greene said, this is the place we can have these discussions. So I appreciate it, and I apologize for those I offended.
And I will say too, I'm going to figure out a way for us to make this right. I don't know what that looks like exactly right now. I know one thing that we do want to do as an organization is to hold a deeper dive discussion about harmful words, harmful imagery, and how we can use situations like this to forge a stronger solidarity across racial, class, gender, sexual orientation lines, and the like. Again, I do also want to apologize for what happened last week. And again, the inability for us to deal with this at the top of the hour, that lies squarely with me as a lead instructor. And so what I would like to do now, does anyone else want to say anything before we go on? Because again, we're not moving on from this conversation per se. I want to say that we will come back to this, of course, but instead I do want to say that I do want to shift gears just a little bit. Before we do that, does anyone else have anything they'd like to say about what happened last week? Any other comments from the audience? Okay, going once, going twice. Okay, and again, by the way, I do want to say one other thing. If you also feel that you're not satisfied with how this space feels to you, I want to encourage folks to reach out to me personally. All right, I don't want folks to feel that they can't talk to me offline about these topics. Of course, I can be reached via email. I have the Progressive Network email, but I'll just put my other personal email in the chat. And again, if you just want to reach out to me and just talk about these issues offline, I'm more than happy to do so. I don't want to leave anyone behind when it comes to these kinds of conversations. And so what I like to do, since we did call that audible and it's now 7:15, I like to very quickly get back, because I do want to get to Lewis Pitt's topic, to really talk about corporate power, because I think one thing that we do want to address too is that how so many of these problems that we've just been talking about have, on a state and national level, also deeply impacted how we're able to really achieve solidarity through political and cultural action and the like. So let me go ahead. I know that it's been a heavy few minutes. Brett, go ahead, please.
Yeah, Dr. Green, before we move off of money and politics and into corporations with all the money, I want to point out that when you ask who runs the elections here in this country, you say, well, who pays for them? And 80% of the money in South Carolina is from corporations. 16% comes from the individuals, and less than 4% from individual donations of less than $200. And so the folks that own the elections are the ones that pay for it, and we see what results we get. So there's more about this in skills and tools sessions that we'll have later, where you can figure out how to use this database to look up who's giving money to whom and et cetera in South Carolina.
Okay, so before we get to Lewis, and I know I've been saying that a lot the last 30 to 45 minutes, I'm gonna do something that I don't think we've done before. Can we take like a 5-minute break? I think folks just need a chance to take a breather just for a quick second, because I know we had some heavy discussion there, and I want us to come back to Lewis's points clear-headed and ready to focus. So I'll stick around for a bit, but I'd like to give us just a 5-minute break. So we'll resume at 7:22, but I just want to give us all a chance to kind of catch our breath for a second, if you don't mind. All right, folks, we'll be starting back up in just another minute or so. So keep in mind that when we come back, when we start, we're going to hand the floor over to Lewis Pitts to talk about corporate power, and really to get at how some of the things we talked about in terms of politics and the like, and the power of money ties inextricably to corporate power and the like. And I think there's a really intriguing history here that Lewis is going to talk about in just a moment that really brings everything together in terms of corporate power. Okay, so, all right, so it is 7:22. Brett, did you want to say something?
Yeah, let me briefly put Lewis in context with reality here. Lewis is a homeboy. Lewis grew up in South Carolina, and he's he left, but he's available for us. Lewis graduated from USC Law School, and he was the attorney for the National Guard and many of our arrests, civil disobedient arrests at nuclear facilities. And he got involved in a national effort dealing with nuclear facilities. He was also worked on the Karen Silkwood case out of Oklahoma. Lewis went on to work with an organization called the Christic Institute that was one of the lead entities investigating the Iran-Contra scandal when the American government was trading guns for drugs. And he has stuck his head up high enough to get it chopped off a couple of times, and he's also been my attorney in any number of good, exciting cases. He was the lead attorney, or one of them, with the case after the Klan killed the protesters in Greensboro in 1979, and won a class action settlement against the city of Greensboro. And he now lives in Greensboro and married a woman that is working at the university, UNC there. And Lewis was one of the founding members of the Program on Law, Corporations, and Democracy, also known as POCLAD, P-O-C-L-A-D. Google it, go there, and you can find a whole lot of stuff about corporations, law, and democracy. And Lewis Pitts is the perfect person to talk to us. So Lewis is also a graduate of the Modjeska School. Lewis, we're so honored to have you. Go for it. Take 30 minutes.
Thank you, Brett, and thank you, everybody. It's nice to see a number of familiar faces still out there. And it's a pleasure to get to speak to this issue. Let me just start by saying that it just echoes what has already been said, that I think a core issue for us as we stay within single issues and as we move forward today in particular is overcoming colonized thinking. That one of the best ways for an opponent to rule us is with the chains of our own ideas. And corporate personhood is certainly an aspect of that colonized thinking. And the antidote to colonized thinking around corporate power is the truly revolutionary concept of a self-governing democracy of, by, and for all the people. So that's the overarching context that I want to speak to. But I want to go back almost, it'll sound like to the beginning, not necessarily Adam and Eve, but let's go back as far as in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Remember, we have these historical we talked about the miseducation that we go through, that we have little benchmarks in our mind. Let me just start with that one. You know, that was the preposterous notion that Columbus discovered land. Never mind, there were native people here, of course, and sort of began the European colonization of the rest of the world. And then you may remember 1522, Magellan sails around the world. And that really has opened the door for globalism of the type of empire, not interconnected with our globe for the harmony and goodwill of all, but for its exportation. And then hopefully we're all now even more familiar than we may have been with the year 1619, after the New York Times special, some of it's being criticized, but the landing at Jamestown, Virginia, of ships with 20 slaves that sort of begins that tragic history that we have. Then a year later, there's 1620. Of course, that's the Pilgrims arriving at Plymouth Rock on the Mayflower. But I sure was not taught that the ship Mayflower had already made 3 prior trips to the British colonies in behalf of a corporation, the East India Company. That was a corporation. So I think it's helpful to realize how many hundreds of years we have been seeing and been colonized by this notion of multinational corporate power. So the East India Company was chartered literally by Queen Elizabeth, the quote, Virgin Queen, from where we get Virginia, in the last day of 1600. So December 31, but you can just remember 1600 even. So by 1619, the Mayflower, as I mentioned, had already been here. We didn't get taught about this. Now, England, our parent country, was already entering behind in the global contest for resources and profits, in a context with the Dutch, the Spanish, the French, the Portuguese for empire, stealing resources, enslaving people, labor, trade routes, etc. Now, in 1606, so 6 years into the existence of the East India Company, the Virginia Company was chartered, another charter issued by the Crown, the East India Company, I should have said this earlier, was a consortium put together by the Queen, but it involved over 200 London merchants and, quote, noblemen to finance the ships. So they were in effect the stockholders. So right there you begin to see that there's an actual merger, a coexistence of the governing power and the business or the corporate or the company power. What's good for General Motors, what's good for East India Company is good for the Crown. And we'll see that play out. So when these charters, and that's the beginning of a corporate charter, were granted from the Queen to say Virginia for the Virginia Company, they literally put in the charter. This is your charter and your authority for three things: to plant, to rule, and to govern. So this notion that a governing entity is a corporate entity and it rules over the people was long in existence before, we know of what became Wall Street. So let me walk that forward a little bit, and I guess we'll skip from 1600, let's jump 160 years ahead. All that is going on around the globe. The East India Company is falling behind its competitors. So by the 1760s and the 1770s, so now another benchmark, 1776, the Declaration of Independence. So just preceding in the lifetime of those folks, you were having the East India Company getting into debt and falling behind in the competition. So what is at play here? The young emerging colonies, not yet states, they've got their own entrepreneurs, their own merchants. Some of them have their own ships and are buying tea maybe from the Dutch companies and corporations. Parliament / East India Company doesn't like that. So you can imagine it doesn't take much horsepower for the Crown to start enacting rules or laws or licensing requirements that would what? Serve the interest of the East India Company and hurt the emerging merchant class in the US. And there you have, that's what really the Boston Tea Party is about. We were taught that it's taxation without representation. That's close. But really what it was that early day version of Walmarting East India Company, trashing the mom and pop at the hardware store or the smaller or whatever everything is. That's why the Boston Tea Party, it was so important. And in today's terms, they dumped, while dressed colonists, mainly the emerging merchant class, dressed in Native American attire, dumped about what today would be $1 million worth of tea into the Boston Harbor, raising hell over that issue. So they had a good distrust. So now that rebellion that was happening pre-1776 was, as I keep saying, the merchant class. We're going to skip ahead about 10 years in a moment at 1786. That's when on our history, we were starting to say, damn, let's write a constitution. How are we going to go together? How are we going to go to Philadelphia, go in that hot building, board up the windows and write a secret document that's called the Constitution? But that hadn't occurred yet. That was more the farmers, the working class people raising their hell, the merchant class. But let me give you a quick example from, there's going to be two books that I'm going to really push here tonight. Here's the first one. It's Tom Hartman, and it's called Unequal Protection. The subtitle, The Rise of Corporate Dominance and the Theft of Human Rights. It's early 2000s. It is really powerful book. So let's go to 1773. And there was pamphleteering going. We all know about the pamphleteering. And there was a anonymous everyman type person who went by the name Rusticus, and the publication was The Alarm. And let me read you what was being said sort of after 160 or so years of global corporate dominance of the world, but even before our nation was founded. Let me find page 56, please. Here's what was put out in effect like a flyer. And if those of you happen to remember Seattle in '99, when there was that protest out there about globalization, see if it doesn't sound like this. Here's what was said. There's a little bit of that stilted language. Oh, are we in like manner to be driven up to the disposal of the East India Company, who have now the assurance to step forth in aid of the minister to execute his plan of enslaving America? Their conduct in Asia for some years past has given simple proof how little they regard the laws of nations, the rights, liberties, and lives of men. Of course, wrong, too narrow. They have levied war, they've excited rebellions, dethroned lawful princes, sacrificed millions for the sake of gain. The revenue of mighty kingdoms have centered in their coffers. And these are not being sufficient to glut their avarice. They have, by the most unparalleled barbarities, extortions, and monopolies, stripped the miserable inhabitants of their property and reduced whole provinces to indigence and ruin. 1,500 thousands, is said, perished by famine in 1 year, not because the earth denied its fruits, but because this company and their servants engulfed all the necessities of life and set them at so high a rate that the poor could not purchase them. Wow, quite a condemnation of that business model. So let's try to zoom ahead a little bit so we don't get stuck in the 1770s. It's interesting, 1776, Declaration of Independence. The Wealth of Nations is written by Adam Smith from England, the very place where there's this parliament. Well, by 16, remember, East India Company was chartered in 1600. By 1680, I think it is, the majority of the parliament members were stockholders in the company. So they had a lockdown on that. So while there's discussion in that book that put out this concept of free enterprise and the invisible hand, it was none of that. That is a total myth. It was all a rigged, hooked, set up deal to make it difficult for anybody but the power structure and their corporate entities to exist. So we have the founders, all of whom were pretty much slave owners. And there was a division within that. None of them really wanted popular rule, this notion of the people, by the people, for them. They talked it up a bit, but they didn't believe in it. Both of the splits in there, and I'll describe what they are, believe there was an elite minority, a select few. There were those like Jefferson who wanted a natural aristocracy. That was his term. That would be more the wise and the capable, the learned classes maybe. And then there was the artificial aristocracy, basically just the wealthy and the noblemen who got it maybe by birth. But none of those folks wanted an actual real people's democracy. So Noam Chomsky has a very nice article. It's a very short, doable article. If you just Google the notion of an elite guardian class dates back to the founding of the US. And he gives you the quotes from, for example, James Madison, that some historians want to revere. He believed in rule by an opulent minority. I looked that up a few years ago to make sure I didn't have it confused. Opulent minority, the rich folk. Madison didn't want to rule by a handful of tyrannical nobles, but he wanted that other class. Alexander Hamilton, who for some reason was made a hero in this play when he was nothing but the early Wall Street. He literally lived on Wall Street at the time. There was a Wall Street in 1776. He feared the rabble more than anyone. He wanted rule, in his words, by the rich and the well-born, and not the rabble, because they were just turbulent and changing, but the rich and well-born could be stable. And then, of course, the first Chief Justice of our system said that those who own the country, who own it, should rule it. They feared the leveling spirit. So that was the beginning, but there was nevertheless, because of that monopoly East India thing, there was a fairly healthy distrust and dislike, as I mentioned, by Jefferson and others, of the corporate rule. So a corporate charter in our nation early on, we're talking about before the Civil War, you couldn't just send in 25 bucks and fill out a form and get a lifetime corporate charter as a business entity. It may have taken 2/3 or 3/4 of a vote of the legislature. And you had to set in your papers, what was your purpose? And to be a corporate entity, you had to have a public purpose. It was very clear that I don't want to use the master-servant dynamic. That's legalese, but that's the wrong one. That the corporation was to serve the public. Like a driver's license is not a right, it's a privilege. And if that corporation tried to live longer than, say, its 20-year charter, it could be abolished by the power of the state and the power of the people. It could not have interlocking boards. It could not create other ones. It could not do all those things that are become so routine that we don't, in our colonized thinking, we don't think to question those defining laws. Those are laws that define who has the power. We tend to skip over and not even think about those. There was no such thing as limited liability. If the people who were invested engaged in something and the boat crashed, or they've had to pay for it all, you weren't limited in your liability. Those are now things that have been changed. So I'm going to skip over any discussion about a case that's called Dartmouth College versus New Hampshire, 1819, other than to say that was the issue of where the state of New Hampshire sued Dartmouth College, which existed pursuant to a Crown grant that gave it ruling power. And the state wanted to say, we want a more fair running of Dartmouth College that's more egalitarian. And the college sued and said, we have absolute power. You have no power us. And the Supreme Court ruled at that time that that was right, that a charter was a contract. And of course, they were going out of their way to give due deference to the business world and contract power. So they said, unless the charter contains a provision that allows limitations on it, you have this unlimited power. And that's the punchline I want to now go with. That triggered an even greater hostility amongst the states and local newspapers and regular people saying, wait a damn minute, if these corporations, that whether it's a railroad, whether it's to build trolleys, whether it's granaries, steam engines starting to happen, a little later, we better go about and make sure that we don't grant a charter that is boundless. So you'd be surprised. Your state, my state of North Carolina now, all in your state constitutions. Look at Article 9 of the South Carolina Constitution, and it'll have some few words that make it express that the legislature still retains power over any corporation. Now, whether we have the power to make your legislature use it to require them to pay a living wage or do that's a different question. But the power is there, because that was how regular people were seeing it. So as I've mentioned, particularly up by the Civil War, here come the railroads. And of course, the railroads and the money and the presidents of the railroads, and they become governors, and then they become justices on the Supreme Court. And there's a power starting to shift. And they are wanting a free hand, along with the other emerging huge capitalist class, to basically dominate and have monopolies on everything. Here's the little old citizens, the little towns, and how this is where we're heading up to the beginning of corporate personhood, which was not Citizens United in 2010, it was 1886. So I'd never thought of this till I started reading. You're a little community in wherever, when we got the railroads connecting East Coast and West Coast, here comes the steam engine, wood-fired, throwing sparks, not just smoke and noise, running over cattle and setting the place on fire and rolling off. So state legislatures or towns, particularly we're talking about towns, because the corporate personhood case is Santa Clara County or counties, they decided to tax railroads at a higher rate than they were taxing people. Pretty straightforward. That's what legislature has taxing power to do. Public health and safety and well-being, that's the main goal of the people representative entity, to put a control and say, you're going to roll through, burn through, tear up things, you're going to have to pay a little more. Well, you can imagine the railroads did not want to do that. So at the very end of the Civil War, Lincoln, before he was assassinated, there's a quote, I won't take time to read it, that he was more terrified about the corporate elite and the money power being enthroned and destroying the republic than he had been about the institution of slavery in the South. That's what Lincoln said. So it was becoming clear. So what did these railroad guys start to do? Well, they were trying to litigate and things, and then we've rolled to the Civil War. Then we're going to get to the Civil War amendments, as you know, 13th, 14th Amendment. 14th is the main one I want to talk about, which said that all people are created equal. All persons shall have equal rights. So at that point, the railroads started crafting an argument. Well, gee, a corporation is made up of men, literally back then, made up of men, and men have equal rights, so a corporation ought to have equal rights. So let's make that argument. Well, they tried that 4 different times. And by 1877, 4 personhood cases had reached the Supreme Court and been rejected for one reason or another. Okay, so what else is happening in 1877? The Hayes-Tillman Compromise. The federal troops are removing, the South is starting to go wild. W.E.B. Du Bois names as one of the principal architects of the capitalist strategy to destroy Reconstruction is a man, a senator named Roscoe Conklin. Well, lo and behold, Roscoe Conklin came up with a completely fabricated argument in about 1882 that, well, when we were passing the 14th Amendment, there was a secret journal, and the secret journal really showed that the Congress intended for that 14th Amendment equal protection, all persons, to include corporations. How convenient. It was totally a fraud. It didn't work at all. But that argument was made most strongly in the San Mateo versus Southern Pacific Railroad in 1883. Now, if I put you to sleep, ding-a-ling, wake up, I want you to get this one, man. Race has been such an incredible dominating factor in our nation, as we know. That case, the best I can tell, was the first example of the white man using the reverse discrimination argument. The ink was barely dry on the 14th Amendment. And the railroads were seizing on it to say, how about us? So I want to read to you some of the argument that was made in the U.S. Supreme Court in that 1883 case by a railroad lawyer who had also been a railroad president. So listen, bear with me. I know I'm about to run out of time, but I want you to hear this one. It is so preposterous. Here they're saying, it's very clear if we look back over the history of the past 20 years that this country has done a great deal for the members of the Negro race. It's made them free men, and it has placed them on par and equality with the white man. But that is none too much. We do not complain of that. We only say that something should now be done for the poor white man. Now he's talking about the railroad corporate executives, okay. We only say that something should now be done for the poor white man. We ask that he be lifted up and put on a level with the Negro. We ask that his, white man's, 14th Amendment be so construed as to concede to the white man equal rights under the Constitution of the U.S. with the black man. Our claim is for universal equality before the law. And it goes on and on like that. Now, just think about that. Now in that case, it's settled. So there was no Supreme Court decision. But quickly ahead, 1986, there was another one, the infamous one of Santa Clara versus the railroad. It was about taxing and on a fence. It had 6 different complicated defenses. One of the arguments that they made, that the railroad made, was that they couldn't be taxed differently than an individual because that would violate their equal protection rights. That's Santa Clara County, California, Southern Pacific Railroad. Now, in the actual opinion of that case, it says, even though it had been argued that there was a constitutional right of the corporation to be a person for equal amendment, equal protection purposes, they said, we don't reach that. We decided on some other technical matter. That's commonly done. The Supreme Court goes out of its way to not grab a constitutional issue if they can solve it otherwise. And they solved it otherwise. But there was a head note put in the written opinion, in the written decision, and there's huge conflict over how that got there, who put it there. But the clerk of court back then was a Harvard Law graduate and had formerly been a president of a railroad. He was the clerk of court. Here's what he put in a head note. Quote, the court does not wish to hear argument on the question of whether the provision of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which forbids a state to deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of laws, and applies to this corporation. We are all of the opinion that it does. Now, there was no such discussion of that. So there you have it. If you want to call it a legal fraud, I don't like that term because it wasn't legal. It was just a giant fraud, a giant fraud. And that led one of our Supreme Court justices, you go back, Black, and I think there's a slide to this, Dr. Greene, it's number maybe 11. This judge, by the way, was from Alabama and had been a member of the Klan, I believe, Hugo Black. But he said, he pointed out, of the 50 years since the passage of the 14th Amendment, only 0.5% of those cases were brought to protect Black people. And over 50% of those cases were brought to protect the rights and extend rights to corporations. So that's where we got this notion. And then that was just a toehold. Then there was all the think tanks and all the horsepower and all the other riggings of the system that you all have already talked about that have brought us to horrible things about corporate power. Now, meanwhile, we know that as late as 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, there were not equal rights for Black folks. Had to be in a separate dining car, a separate car. Women weren't attributed equal rights. Now, as late as 1970, in a case called Austin versus Michigan, the state of Michigan had passed a law that said no corporation could be involved in giving money in an election. Pretty straightforward. because of distorting and corruptive power. The Supreme Court there ruled that's correct, that if a state concludes that the corrosive, distorting effects of huge aggregates of capital accumulated by the corporate form were going to warp our democracy, they could ban it. Duh. That's the exact case that was overruled in Citizens United in 2010 when Justice Kennedy said this, and I'm trying to rapidly bring it to a close here. Here's what he wrote to 2010. We now conclude that independent expenditures, including those made by corporations, do not give rise to the corruption or even the appearance of corruption. The appearance of influence or access will not cause the electorate to lose faith in our democracy. Hence, spend all the money you want, and they've continued to buy every conceivable thing they can. And I'll quickly add, the SC Progressive Network was one of the early organizations to join in the national movement to move to amend the Constitution to make it clear. So let me bring us up a little closer. That's some examples. You've got the World Trade Organization, literally a cabal of corporate leaders and corporate lawyers who meet as if they govern the world in secrecy with the power to issue rulings that overrule national and state laws enacted by our representatives. So this is like something that could be on a sci-fi channel or a movie, you know, what's that, Comet Channel or something, but it's real life, it's actually happening. That's what all Trans-Pacific Partnership. And then the final book that I want to urge everybody to read is, oh my God, what a damn ripoff, Wall Street and its so-called regulation by the Securities Exchange Commission and the Federal Reserve and all that is. So there's a website I'll start with first, Wall Street on Parade, right? Wall Street on Parade, it comes out, you get a free email every day if you want to, and it'll just blow your mind. Before COVID had even been thought of in September, before we knew it in March, the Federal Reserve had already started doling out trillions of dollars to those huge corporations who were running out of money. When we get over to COVID, they say, oh, because the economy shut, they're bailing them out because there's another bubble building. And then we get told that we can't have Medicare for all, that Bernie and all of the people we like, not just Bernie because he's a bro, but all the good people, AOC and so forth, that all that shit they want, you can't afford that. That's just pie in the sky, you gotta be real. Read this book, The Deficit Myth. If you don't know of this one, you just have to buy it. Within 100 pages in it, it basically says money is thus a computer stroke, and that spending money for things that the people need, like Medicare for all and jobs and a Green New Deal, won't cause the inflation, and you just do it. That's the way it's done anyway. So let me stop with that. I think the issues continue to be who rules. We should not pit oppressions together and turn into a circular firing squad with one another, nor stay in our silos. But even with silo or individual work, think about how do we get and actually achieve a self-governing democracy, and based on something that Dr. Greene and Brett were talking about earlier, an education system that instills, we've heard the 3 R's of education, reading, writing, arithmetic. There's the 3 C's of critical thinking, of citizenship thinking, of public education. Critical, creative, and courageous thinking to be able to challenge our colonized thinking and take the power that we're entitled to have. Thanks for letting me hoot and holler like that.
Thanks so much, Louis, for that illuminating and enlightening discussion, because I think that what you really got there with the history of corporate power in American life since before there was a United States, this is some really important information here, because it puts into context not only the historical issues of corporate personhood, but as Louis mentioned at the end of his conversation, the issues of corporate personhood and campaign finance, et cetera, that we've seen since 2010 with Citizens United. Again, that didn't come out of the ether, out of thin air. Those issues were kind of bubbling under the surface, and it's up to us now to try to deal with these problems as best we can. Now, the good news is that Lewis put that in context for us. The bad news is that he has now told us that we now have 400 years of history to kind of push back against. But in South Carolina, as is the case with slavery, racism, gender discrimination, and so forth, that's nothing new for us.
Dr. Greene, the next few panels of guiding our discussion, I think the one we need to touch on and then move to the part where people can make comments is this one. And that I promise you that most people think that capitalism is somehow written into stone at Plymouth Rock. And it's not. It's not even a political system. And so I think that kind of like at least opens people's understanding to the need to be able to discuss the economic system. Should be characterized by private ownership, or should it be characterized by the commonwealth is the term. I mean, can we use our endless source of money that's called sovereign wealth? Lewis Pitts just pointed out that the deficit is a myth. We can continue printing money as long as we balance supply and demand. But who decides that? And it's the people that make the most money. And so it's not a political system, it's not a human system, and it's not a sociological system. It's all about the money. And so, Dr. Greene, you want to move on to the next slides and solicit comments from the class about what things they think, how this applies in South Carolina in their life.
Yeah, and so I think to piggyback off of what Brett just said there, I do want to open the floor to discussion for these next couple of slides, because we're getting into talking about the themes of capitalism and specifically thinking about the free market. And oftentimes you'll see politicians in both Republican and Democratic parties saying that above all else, whether they disagree on civil rights or abortion or anything else, they will always say we are fans of the free market system. The free market, capitalism, as Lewis talked about, the idea of free enterprise. These are the kinds of things that politicians often love to say they support in an American context. But I want to ask folks in the class, what are some of the downsides of a supposedly unregulated market? Number one, what does that mean to folks in the class? You can either unmute yourselves or just put your answer in the chat. Let me see. Well, okay, Omari says there was no free market in 2008 for the bailout. So there is, again, this idea of, well, okay, the free market for who exactly, right? Like, who is it a free market for? Who is allowed to succeed or fail versus who is buttressed by the economic and corporate forces and government forces? Anybody else? There's some downsides to a supposedly unregulated market.
Well, Dr. Greene, I'll just throw out a very short one that I heard some economists talk. It inevitably creates, if there is such a thing, winners and losers, because it's sort of the dog eat dog, or the larger, dominant, already in power monopoly types can gobble up. Since wealth always, one of your first slides, I believe tonight, wealth converts to power. And those with the wealth convert that to the political power to gain the laws, the regulations, rig the regulatory system to do whatever they need. And it in no way regulates or has a tending to ensure there's a full economy, full employment at a decent wage, and that environmental damage is not externalized and we end up having a destroyed earth. I just find it's a complete made up fantasy, because the minute there's losses, there's socialism, as Omari was pointing out. Bail them out if they lose money, but every bit they make that they want to call profit, they get to keep it all and hide it from taxes.
And in fact, to your point, there was just a story that came out, I want to say less than a week ago, about some of the wealthiest Americans and how little they actually pay in income tax. And none of that's illegal. Again, going back to this point about who has the power, who has the wealth in society, they are simply using tax rules that have been written for decades that Congress has passed and allows to be enforced, that allow them to shift their money in any number of ways, to not pay taxes on it any number of ways as well. And so I think with that in mind, and again, some of the folks in the chat are talking about, in particular, the last 15 years of history, right? The 2008 financial crisis, some of the problems we have to deal with economically with bailouts and who gets bailed out. Again, these are issues that have come up time and time again. And by the way, keep in mind that many of us have been alive for several financial crises. We had 2008, and then last year, with the pandemic, we were basically plunged into, if not a depression, at least a severe recession. Brett, go ahead.
Dr. Greene, one of the things that just has always irritated me is that the textbooks in America that teach children about history are actually driven by Texas, because Texas has more consumers than any other state in the K through 12 market. And so Houghton Mifflin, who's the largest producer of textbooks, had to go along with the Texas School Board, which is composed of right-wing lunatics, and they actually said you have to replace the term capitalism with free market. And so that's, in terms of the impact of capital and on learning and the wealth, the quality of our lives, they're actually getting into that thing we talked about, is educating people about what they need to know to stay in line and be good consumers.
Indeed, indeed. Jean, your hand is raised. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I just want to say can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can.
To Mr. Pitts, thank you. I never understood how Mittens could say a corporation is people. People are corporations too. Corporations are people too. I never understood that. Now I totally understand it. And I know he's a lying, cheat, and a thief, and everything else. So thank you.
Ms. Hammock, I've heard recently, I believe corporations are people when Texas executes one.
Now that is one creative way to think about it, certainly. Now I do also, yeah, and I think Cecil's point about the word capitalism itself losing some utility and losing some of its luster in recent years is also worth talking about too, because there have been some recent opinion polls that have shown, amongst younger Americans in particular, that the term socialism is not nearly as scary as it used to be historically, whereas the term capitalism is not nearly as awe-inspiring as it once was. And I think if you're a young person, if you're in Generation Z, especially, or even a millennial like myself, your lifetime has not really exactly provided some great examples of capitalism in action. Whether it's 2008 financial crisis, the recent pandemic, the slow recoveries from both of those, I think those are all worth talking about and thinking about as well. And again, with the little slideshow we were just showing, we do also want to think about the question of, is capitalism itself, ideas of capitalism and the free market, are they actually conducive to social democracy?
No.
Let me interrupt you and point out that when capitalism was on a surge here in America, it was after World War II, when there was this tremendous effort that was put into construction and building, and that the GI Bill and all of that stuff happened and left Black people out of it.
Oh, well, I'm sure that was just a coincidence.
Oh.
No, but you're absolutely right. I mean, I think a lot of what we're talking about here, we're talking about these conceptions of communism, of capitalism, of socialism, of free market capitalism, et cetera. Again, a lot of these ideas were built up before the Cold War, certainly during the Cold War, putting them in a much larger context of anti-radical rhetoric in American society, again, is really important. I want to go back to Lewis's talk for a second, because Lewis mentioned that one thing we should all be cognizant of is that even though we tend to put this in context of the Cold War, you go back to the Reconstruction era at the very end of it. Reconstruction in 1877, when it formally comes to an end, that same year, you're starting to see more and more debates about capitalism in American society. That same year, you have the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, where more Americans are beginning to join unions. They're beginning to think about labor radicalism in a different light than they had before. And so the crushing of Reconstruction, the crushing of this labor radicalism is not a coincidence that it happens at the same time. So I do now want to introduce to the class another quick idea, because we've been talking a lot about what the free market means, what corporate and political power means. But as we've been talking about this entire semester, when we talk about laws and regulations, we're also talking about what a nation deems to be morally important, what a nation therefore deems to be politically important. And so I want to show you guys a quick stat about social welfare spending, and to really kind of think about how the US, in terms of its relationship to other nations, how much GDP it spends on social welfare. So this may or may not be a surprise to many of you. I doubt it'll be much surprise to any of us. But this is a slide that gives some fairly recent information about how government spending as a share of GDP works. And again, a lot of this, not all of it, but quite a bit of it relates to social welfare spending, right? So you see Iceland spends over half its GDP, its government spending is over half its GDP, as is the case with Sweden and France. And the United States is at 38.9%, Russia 34.1%, and China at about 20% of its GDP. But this is one of many indicators of how certain nations are able to use their budgets as documents to say, this is what's important to us in terms of government spending. Now, Brett, I want to ask you a quick question. When this says government spending as a percentage of GDP, does that include military spending, or is this just social welfare spending?
This is social welfare spending, because if we add in military spending, we would find that the United States of America spends more than all these countries combined on military. And so the question is, what do you get for being a citizen? Now, we all get tons of nuclear weapons. And I bet you that most of us would trade one Trident nuclear submarine or maybe even one missile for healthcare. And so that's what Joe Biden said, show me your budget and I'll show you your values. And so this really plays very hard into the concept that government's bad. Ronald Reagan took this to the limit, and we haven't gotten over it, that the government is bad. And so we have to starve the government to this size that can be shrunk in a bathtub. That was one of his advisors. And so what happens then is you don't have any government benefits. And so then you believe, oh, well, government's bad. And so it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. The countries here at the top, Iceland and Sweden and France, they actually take care of people. They actually take care of your health care. They would give you leave, man or woman, to take care of a new child. And you don't worry about having your home taken away from you when you're sick. And so if you could break it down, if we can break it down, if we can talk to people about if we could work together and share resources, we actually can get more for our money, education, healthcare, et cetera, than having to go through a private industry like the insurance for healthcare. We pay 50% more than all of these countries for healthcare because the government's bad. And we don't want the government to handle healthcare. An example is when we finally got to the point we were going to take in prescriptions into Medicare. George Bush said that we can't do that as the government. And so we added Part D of the Medicare and we privatized it. And we can't compete. Medicare cannot compete, or it can't can't bargain with the pharmaceutical companies, and so Canada can. So we go to Canada and can get our drugs for 25% less, or 25% as much. So this is smoke and mirrors on the part of the people that are running our economy. Dr. Greene, I don't know if I answered your question.
I think that that's certainly a great answer to it. And I think even to talk about this some more, I want to relate a very personal story before we go on. One of my closest friends actually lives in Uruguay. He's a postdoc there in biology. And he has often mentioned how he has been repeatedly surprised by how much, in terms of healthcare and dental care, is subsidized there versus the United States. And his partner now she's actually from Uruguay, and she often jokes with him that when he, for example, is reluctant to go to the doctor or dentist because of his concern about costs, she jokes with him that you're like an American, that you're concerned about your bills, when in Uruguay, again, I use Uruguay as an example because when we talk about social welfare spending and the like, we tend to look towards Western Europe, but Uruguay, a nation that is a poor nation, it is a quote unquote developing nation, but it in fact has a rich history unto itself, a rich culture, and an economy and a government that really thinks about these things in a holistic light. There, he's able to get dental care and doctor care almost free of charge. Or with his dental visit a few months ago, it was like a very, very cheap fee. And yet he found himself concerned about going to the dentist because as an American, he grew up in a system where if you go to the dentist for any emergency, it breaks the bank. And so again, these budgets are very much moral documents that speak to, if not what the people prioritize, be more accurate to say what the people in power prioritize. And what we're finding in this class is those are often two very different subjects. Okay. Now, really quickly, because I know that in recent years especially, and this is one of the joys of teaching the Modjeska School in 2021, is that we are all very much working in a time period of U.S. history where there is some hope that Americans are more amenable or open to political ideas and ideologies that about a generation ago or so would have been largely laughed out of the room. And I do want to very briefly mention the ideas behind democratic socialism, which is again one of the ideologies that has kind of gained more attention in recent years, partly because of Bernie Sanders, partly because of the growth of things like Democratic Socialism of America, the growth of left-leaning journals and magazines, things like that. But I do want to, again, bring up this point more so to think about what we in South Carolina can do to create a government here. Because I know in the chat that someone had mentioned a moment ago, Keith points out that, the Democratic Party is often very good at galvanizing support for national elections, but is not quite as focused on state elections like it should be. But what we're seeing is that state to state, many of these problems come up time and again. But I think one thing we do want to talk about for a brief moment, and again, this relates back to what we were talking about earlier with how capitalism and socialism, at least rhetorically, are seen differently than they have been ever before, is that when we talk about capitalism and socialism, is that there is a big divide between those two systems on the government's role in caring for people's economic well-being. Now, just to be clear here, socialism as an ideology goes well beyond what the government does and really imagines more a classless society that does not need, in the long run, and its completion into becoming a socialist state, it does not need these kinds of precepts of government as we know them. It's thinking more of a classless society, one where workers and everyone is being taken care of fairly and equitably. But we do want to think about the fact that as we try to push for things like economic or social democracy, can you really separate that from the ideas of political democracy? Can a free market capitalist system be truly democratic? Again, these are questions that activists have been wrestling with for centuries now. A great example of this, of course, is Martin Luther King Jr. The fact that throughout the course of his career. And just like Lewis, I'm going to recommend the book as well. From Civil Rights to Human Rights by Thomas J. Jackson. It is an excellent book about how Dr. King thought about capitalism and social democracy and socialism throughout his entire career. We tend to think that he only started thinking about this in the last year of his life, but in fact, behind the scenes, he and many other civil rights activists like Bayard Rustin and Ralph Abernathy, and his wife, Berta Scott King, many others, they all had these conversations about, as we push forward for civil rights, we need to also be thinking about the broader fight for human rights, which included economic inequality, which included these questions about free market capitalism versus socialism and the like. And it's not a coincidence that at the end of Dr. King's life, when he's speaking out against the Vietnam War, when he is heavily criticizing American society for being incredibly white supremacist, he's also talking about economics and the need to move away from a capitalist free market system that he felt in 1968 was certainly not working. Okay. So I do want to talk about, just to end here and really open up conversation again. You want to think about what democracy looks like in South Carolina. Of course, this slide is titled "Democracy is Dead in South Carolina." It may be worth asking the question, was it ever alive in the first place? And I think, all kidding aside, we do have to deal with the fact that South Carolina, by every metric we can think of, is one of the least democratic states of the Union. And this is largely by design. Now, this entire semester we spent talking about folks like John Locke, your John C. Calhouns, your Ben Tillmans, your James Burns, your Strom Thurmonds, and many others who have all promulgated and crafted this system that we live with now in South Carolina that is very anti-democratic. There is no use pretending, as the slide says, that South Carolina is democracy when more than 70% of its citizens have only one person to vote for. When the majority of legislators are chosen in the primaries by fewer than 13% of the population. Now, historically, South Carolina, with the exception of the Reconstruction era, has been a state that has been reluctant to be democratic in any form or fashion. Now, today, that lack of democracy looks a bit different than it did 100 years ago in the Jim Crow era, although some folks might take us back to that too, if they had their way. But what I will say, and I think Keith is exactly right, the system is not broken. It is working exactly as it was designed to be. The question we all have to ask ourselves is, what are we going to do about it? It's not going to be easy, that much is for sure. But in South Carolina, we've got a lot of work to do because, after all, and I'll end here, what happens in the Palmetto State doesn't stay in the Palmetto State. If we can fight for democracy here and make serious gains here, then they could travel across the country. But on the flip side, if undemocratic forces continue to triumph in South Carolina, then they're going to triumph in North Carolina, in Georgia, in Michigan, in Nevada, in Texas, all over the country.
Dr. Greene, Jackie Reinhardt asked about that, something we had up on the screen about only, most people don't have but only one person to vote for, and she wants to know what's up with that. And that's the gerrymandering that has made safe seats. And that a longer discussion that can be found a whole lot of detail at fairmapssc.com, but that the average in the last four, probably 5 now, 20 years of general elections, is that the number of seats, I'm going to use the Democrats as an example, that Democrats hold in the House has ranged from 42 to 44. Is that right, Kyle? Nod your head. And Kyle's got 2 more brain cells at least than I do. And so it doesn't matter how many people you register to vote and turn out. It matters how many people have been packed into districts that have an effective vote. And so since in Lexington County, it doesn't matter if all the people that have been characterized as Democrats, which would be black people and thinking people, if we all registered, we still couldn't change the outcome because the people that have been doing the redistricting so cleverly have gerrymandered things. And so literally, we have amongst the nation's least competitive elections, and it changes us in Georgia, a couple other places, because you can't affect the outcome no matter how many people vote of how many seats the Democrats or the Republicans hold. You can change the name of a Democrat or Republican in the seat, but you can't change the party with maybe less than 17% of the seats out of 170, 10%, excuse me, 17 out of 170, which would be 10%. And Kyle Kriminger is our co-chair of the South Carolina Progressive Network Education Fund, who's done most of the work on crunching those numbers. And if that answer isn't clear enough, I'm sure that Kyle can answer.
All right. So any questions about tonight's class? Thinking about corporate personhood, corporate power versus political power, and the like. Any questions at all? Keith, go ahead, please. I see your hand is raised.
Not so much a question, but a comment on how eye-opening the readings were for tonight's class. Oh my God. It's there's a long history. We have a big job in front of us. And I'm fortunate that I have some grandchildren, granddaughters who are empowered to take it on. Thank you.
Yeah, we've definitely got a lot of work to do.
Can I ask Lewis to talk a little bit about why he quit the North Carolina bar?
Sure, Becky. Let me give you a little history. I started out as a lawyer in finishing law school in 1973. By 1979 or 80, I pretty quickly figured out the whole thing was rigged. And I wanted to be a revolutionary, not in that system, but out of it, trying to overthrow it. And then, oddly enough, I ran into some members of the Communist Workers' Party. You think they would be going, yeah, but they said, wait, the legal system is used to legitimate the system we've got. And it's used to attack and undermine movements and movement leaders. We need lawyers who will get in there and help fight to defend those movements and those leaders and to expose the injustice in it. So I said, yeah, that makes sense. So I got a little haircut and took the earpiece out and got a briefcase again and did that for 30 or 40 years, maybe 30. And then the hypocrisy of every bar has a rule of professional responsibility. And it says a lawyer's three things. Supposed to be a vigorous advocate for your client, kind of depends on how much money you pay, all right, and an officer of the court. But then you're supposed to be, this is the quote, a public citizen with a special responsibility for the quality of justice. So this is 2014. It was bad then. It seems like it's actually worse now. The bar wasn't taking a stand, and I wrote him and said, I cannot stand the hypocrisy. I'm going to quit. I don't want to be put on inactive status. I want out of this, and I encourage you to take this historical moment to look at the role of the bar. And I quoted some things to kind of say that was said by Supreme Court justices and all during the New Deal, that the bar had been absent AWOL during the takeover of the financial institutions that led to the collapse of 29. The bar's response, okay, we'll put you on inactive status. So I had to write back and say, I insist on quitting, and if you don't let me quit, I'll sue you to make a rule. I said, we don't have any rule that allows you to quit. So the irony is when I tried to get admitted to the North Carolina bar in 1994, they had said I wasn't morally fit to be a lawyer. So I had to call witnesses like John Hope Franklin and other I think significant people to say, okay, the guy's at least got enough ethics to get in the bar. And then when I tried to get out, I couldn't stand the hypocrisy. So I still try to be a liaison between and I don't discourage people from going to law school. We need more, even though the Supreme Court is more rigged than ever, we need more than ever movement lawyers who will fight, defend, and protect these movements. But my mental health was caving in with the hypocrisy and the constraints. So I quit the bar and have just tried to keep being an activist. Thanks for letting me talk about that. It's mistaken to mean I think you're a sellout if you're a lawyer. It's how you're a lawyer, it's whether or not you're a sellout, not if you're a lawyer. At least
Liz Pitts is my only lawyer that went to jail with me, and so that's all I got to say.
I think I've been arrested 6 or 7 times. And it was in Columbia, South Carolina, as a very young lawyer that I started carrying a toothbrush in my back pocket because I never knew when I might end up in a slammer and I wanted to brush my teeth. Thanks for letting me share a story like that, John.
No, I'm glad you did, because that reminds us of how each and every one of us can make a difference in a variety of different ways. There's no correct or straight path towards trying to achieve the kind of change we want to see. But it's a lot of hard work. And I'm not sure if I want to carry around a toothbrush all the time in my back pocket, but again, this kind of shows how you have to also be forward thinking as well and strategizing short term and long term too. So we have reached the 8:30 mark. I know folks might want to mingle a bit after class is over. Before we do that, I just want to remind folks, next Monday, of course, is our practicum discussion. We're really talking about, now that we're basically done with the class, thinking about how we take what we've learned so far and how we think about applying it to projects within the Progressive Network, perhaps proposing new projects we could potentially do as well, and thinking about taking that leap from concerned and engaged citizen to activist. Now, again, that's not a requirement of the class per se to become an activist, but we do want to encourage folks to really get involved in whatever way they see fit, including through some of the projects that the Progressive Network has been sponsoring for some time now.
And Robert, we're going to be doing what we've been wanting to do ever since we started the school 6 years ago, skills and tools classes, where people that are just your average citizen that wants to be more effective can learn how to find resources that enable them to do so. And organizers that want to roll up their sleeves and be more engaged can certainly benefit from knowing where to look for the dirt that they need to be able to teach people. And so that's what we'll be talking about. That, and we're going to model these classes. We may have a class on learning municipal elections and redistricting. If nobody signs up for it, it won't happen. I don't know whether there's 3 of you or 5 of you, but we're going to have a laundry list, kind of like an a la carte menu of skills and resources. And we can bring in people that we've met over the years that are the best people in these fields to help. And so you need to help us shape that which it is that you need to know.
Exactly. And again, this has been another important class. I'm glad we had our discussion this evening as well. And again, I want to remind folks that this is a space that is meant to be a useful, informative, and impactful space for all of us. So I want folks to still feel welcome and comfortable here. And don't forget that on July 3rd, we also have our graduation as well. So I'm hoping to actually meet many of you in person for the first time. That would be certainly wonderful as well.
And Robert, we do need to mention that we have relocated the graduation to the Siebel's house, which is at the corner of Richland and Pickens in Columbia. It's the oldest home in Columbia. It's the 1700s. Tremendous history there that is revelatory and painful that we have discussed in our classes, but it's a absolutely fine facility for that can accommodate us. Their bathrooms actually work, and the ones at our building don't. And so they have indoor plumbing, and so people will, you'll get more notices about that. And we've only got, I don't know, very few numbers of T-shirts that people have ordered for their graduation. And see anything, Becky? Anything else? Well, Becky's not in her chair. So
And
we'll be in touch in regards to details about the graduation as we move closer to it. But we're going to have a chat after this, after we have some music, Robert.
yes, that's right. And again, this graduation, is it going to be a hybrid graduation?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
Clear it up.
Hybrid meaning in Newspeak, you can stay home and watch it on Zoom, or you can come and be face to face with us. And if you haven't had both shots, we'll keep you at, I don't know, 50 or 75 feet away. But the Siebel's house has enough room where you can like stand outside and press your nose against the window if you hadn't had your shots.
All right. Well, on that note, let's go ahead and play the music. And then if you want to stick around afterwards, you're certainly welcome to do so. So until next week, have a good rest of your evening and a good week. And we'll see you all next Monday.